All right, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on when you're watching this. This will be part 2 of Unconventional Human Intelligence Support, Transcendent and Asymmetric Warfare Implications of Remote Viewing. And I'm going to speed scroll here, so if anybody has any issues with that, look away. So we left off at a Soviet target. During the following year, 1974, the CIA presented SRI with a long-distance remote viewing experiment intended to test more fully the operational utility of this method of intelligence collection. The CIA requested that SRI, employing long-distance scanet procedures in a manner similar to the West Virginia site experiment, provided information about a Soviet site of ongoing operational significance. SRI employed Pat Price for the experiment. The CIA provided the map coordinates for an unidentified research facility in Semiplantinsk, USSR, a highly secret Soviet nuclear munition site where work was thought to involve development of particle beam weapons. Price accurately described the facility and the highly sensitive work that was being accomplished there. In particular, he sketched a giant crane-like structure that literally rolled over the tops of buildings it straddled. Price's drawings, along with an artist's drawing of the actual site based on a satellite photograph, comprises figure A and B, that's in the back of this. Additionally, Price described ongoing work inside one of the buildings that involved problems the Soviets were experiencing in welding together thick metal gores for the construction of a 60-foot sphere. According to Targ, we didn't get any feedback on this for more than 3 years. We discovered how accurate Price's viewings were when this sphere fabricating activity at Semiplantinsk was eventually described in Aviation Week magazine, May 2, 1977. Unfortunately, by then, Price had died. Russell Targ observed Price during the above experiment. They were both in an electrically shielded room of SRI's radio physics building, located approximately 10,000 miles from Semiplantinsk. Targ knew nothing of the Semiplantinsk site so as to guard against the potential for cueing or telepathy. Regarding this experiment, Targ stated, "The accuracy of Price's drawing is the sort of thing that I, as a physicist, would never have believed if I had not seen it for myself." While Price had significant success with this site, he also reported a good deal of information that proved to be inaccurate according to some of the CIA analysis. Significantly, this result was accomplished during the first ever operational test of remote viewing for a Soviet site and was not one of the best ever results achieved through the duration of the program. Price's performance during the experiment, with its mix of accurate and inaccurate results, was fairly representative of remote viewing in general. As subsequently discovered, some early remote viewing inaccuracies may have resulted from how protocols were employed. For example, during an early SRI outbound experiment, Price proved extremely accurate in describing a San Francisco Bay Area site. 2 water tanks that he had reported as being at the site were not there, however, and his observation was dismissed as inaccurate. Years later, SRI researchers discovered, via an old photograph of the same site, the 2 missing water tanks had stood in exactly the locations described by Price, but many years prior to the actual remote viewing. As a result, the SRI team realized it was therefore crucial to specify exactly when in time the remote viewing experiment was to be focused. Well, that's profound right there, right? When in time? So basically he describes something that used to be there in real time, in the present. The experiment was thought inaccurate, but after seeing older photographs of it, they realized that he saw something that used to be there. I guess the only way to debunk that is to say, well, if he didn't know where the location was, right? If he wasn't predisposed to know what they were going to task him with, he couldn't have previously visited the site, or he would not have, someone would not have been able to prime him or front load him with that information. The CIA's reaction. As a result of the West Virginia and Semiplantisk experiments, Dr. Kenneth A. Kress, a physicist and former CIA contract monitor for the SRI research, wrote a synopsis of the program efforts in an article entitled Parapsychology in Intelligence, a Personal Review and Conclusions. At the time of its publication, the article was classified top secret and disseminated within the intelligence community. Since then, it has been declassified and presents an even-handed remote viewing program evaluation. In his article, Kress addresses some of the CIA's and other agencies' attitudes toward SRI's research and results. He concludes that the research and experiments demonstrated paranormal abilities, but the researchers had not sufficiently explained them or achieved reproducibility. These conclusions were drawn from observations that the participating military and intelligence agencies were application-oriented and thereby focused on immediate and relevant results, rather than the development and understanding of the underlying science and mechanical processes involved. Kress suggests to better determine how paranormal phenomena could be employed for intelligence collection and related purposes. Additionally, Kress briefly addresses the national and political climate during the period when the CIA was providing remote viewing research for SRI. He notes that the Proxmire effect was in full force during the time, and any government contracts of questionable nature were routinely being held up to ridicule and scorn. The CIA, in particular, was under scrutiny because of its earlier involvement with controversial areas of research, especially research with LSD, reportedly connected to a death. Because the CIA was concerned that SRI research might be perceived as some form of mind-altering influencing technique, and therefore linked to earlier tainted research with LSD, the agency subsequently decided to officially terminate its support for SRI research in 1975. Yet, the end of the CIA's support for SRI's remote viewing did not sound the program's death knell. The Defense Intelligence Agency had become interested in the program, as had the U.S. Air Force. Both were providing pragmatic funding by the time of the CIA's official disengagement. So Kress sort of addresses what I said, where there wasn't a sound, sufficiently explained ability to reproduce, or at least to explain how it was functioning. But that doesn't disprove anything. That just means it still has to be figured out. But in the previous video, in part one, at the end, I had mentioned, there's still some ways to fudge this stuff and that haven't been explained, especially with the longitude and latitude stuff. As far as giving somebody a set of coordinates and then just knowing where to go spiritually or mentally or physically. The point A to point B. And let me just expound on that a little bit. So in the previous one, we learned that someone was able to use a beacon, whereby if somebody was already at the location, there's later research suggesting that you could see what someone else was seeing. And in our older myths and religious texts and sacred texts, we often have some stories of people using animals as a way to infiltrate or to observe other occurrences. I've mentioned Odin's eyes, which are ravens or crows, and what are some other ones? My point here is I'm trying to gently go on this topic, is that if the idea with or without shielding is that if I'm a remote viewer or CRV or very powerful empathic or telepathic, and I can't get into the room itself, but I could get into the head of an observer or participant in the room. I can see what they're seeing. With that, though, that would stand to reason then you could also probably use an animal. So in this case, if there was a bird flying above a target and I wasn't able to see the target myself or penetrate the target, maybe I could link up with the bird somehow. So that may sound far-fetched, but using the eyes of a bird, the eyes of a bug. I myself have had experiences where it was only later after rationalizing what I actually saw. And when I say what I saw, I don't mean with my own eyes. I just mean with what I saw with, let's say, my mind's eye. the the angles of how I saw things, the size of how I saw things, my perception and my scale to what I saw, being small or large, high above or very close in, really makes me think that I was somehow connecting to something else there to see it. There have been situations where I myself felt like I was floating in a smaller room and there couldn't have possibly been any sort of bug or bird or mouse or person there for me to link up with and then use their eyes to see things. And that could loosely reference what we often call the orbs or the spotted light, where presence is seen but maybe not felt, or felt but not seen. The 1,000-yard stare, that kind of stuff. And that potentially could reference the effect that Ingo Swann had on a magnetometer or magnometer in the SRI's basement on that device, which is used to record and track earthquakes and things like that. That the presence and appearance of the consciousness in any waveform or wave field can be detected both by a human with trained abilities or by a device that can recognize the distribution of that presence as it enters the wave field. So we have a couple thoughts there where, yeah, speaking to animals, or in effect using animals to see other things, and more technological aspects where we have aura cameras now, and we have heat signatures and biosignatures and X-ray devices that can do 100 times better in terms of what they're actually picking up on, whether it be someone's alpha or brain waves, and then visualizing that on a screen. So they're not just getting a printout on it of an analog printout showing a two-dimensional graph where we can say, hey, a thought occurred here and a thought occurred here, where these spikes occur on the line. But now we have video equipment, we have lenses and glass and mirrors that are charged with electricity and lasers that are able to record in real time the heat signature of an object as it moves across the terrain of the planet. And it's not without reason to suggest, as I have suggested in other videos, that that too includes being able to pick up a biosignature. And if that's possible, then you would also be able to pick up increased brain activity or emotional distress into states. The program expands and evolves. The INSCOM program. One result of Kress's article was its impact upon the U.S. Army intelligence community. Members of the 902 Military Intelligence Group Counterintelligence Division read the article and realized that if remote viewing was as effective as reported by Kress, then the 902 group, as well as U.S. research and development efforts, were vulnerable to its employment by potential enemies. About this time, the 902 group was being absorbed into the newly established U.S. Army Intelligence Support Command, INSCOM. INSCOM set about developing a separate program whose goal was determining the U.S. military's vulnerability to remote viewing. In July 1978, INSCOM initiated a 3-year remote viewing program, codenamed Gondola Wish, in which the first year would be devoted to training, the second to testing, and the third year to evaluation and reporting. 5 months into the first year's training program, however, the Iran hostage crisis developed. The training program was consequently terminated, and INSCOM's cadre of 6 remote viewers immediately went operational. Since Gondola Wish had been the code name for the initial training program, it was renamed Grill Flame, concurrent with the program's new operational status. So McMongle or McMoneagle, apologize, sir, McMoneagle. If you're looking on screen here, there's a couple references to a McMoneagle interview, and I think that's Joe McMoneagle. And he was most likely part of the program. You can actually look up this group on Wikipedia as well. The 902 military group. The Iran hostage crisis. With 5 months training under their respective belts, the Grill Flame remote viewers began receiving a massive influx of tasking and associated intelligence support requests from the National Security Council. One of the NSC's original obstacles encompassed identifying exactly who, among the over 400 Americans known to be in Iran at the time, were in fact being held hostage. The Grill Flame remote viewers were successful in identifying all 64 American hostages. Further, they identified 3 Americans who, due to the sensitive nature of their assignments, were being held at a separate location from the main body of hostages. Had Grill Flame members not identified the 3, thereby enabling our government to negotiate for their release along with the others, in addition to letting the Iranians know that we knew they were holding them hostage, they likely would have not been tortured to death. Throughout the Iran hostage crisis, Grill Flame members accomplished over 600 remote viewings for the NSC. As a result of their successes, Grill Flame members began receiving weekly remote viewing tasks from the NSA, CIA, DIA, Secret Service, FBI, and a host of federal agencies and organizations. Let's pause on that very short but informational section here. The program expands and evolves. So as I just read this, apparently what happened is hostages were killed because the government would not show how they received that intel. That's how I'm interpreting this. For whatever reasons they wanted to keep the program secret or did not want to admit to it, per Kress's saying that there was an effort in the government to really just minimize anything that wasn't, to scrutinize every budgetary concern, so to speak. That although, what should be remarkable to anybody listening to this or reading this document, although 64 hostages were correctly identified, including 3 that were probably under some sort of even more secure intelligence function, right? We're just talking about CIA or NSA, whatever. These 3 other hostages were taken somewhere differently because they were found out to be working covertly in the country. Let's just read it again. Further, they identified 3 Americans who, due to the sensitive nature of their assignments, were being held at a separate location from the main body of hostages. Had Grill Flame members not identified the 3, thereby enabling our government to negotiate for their release along with the others, in addition to letting the Iranians know that we knew they were holding them hostage, they likely would have been tortured to death. They would have been tortured to death. So with the success of the program, I'm not going to backtrack on that thought. I just made a conceptual error there as I was trying to explain the efficacy of the program. The efficacy of the program in this little paragraph here shows how valuable it actually was, that people would have died. Apologize to the listener there. So again, we see, I mean, this is all in the books. NSA, CIA, DIA, Secret Service, FBI, and a host of federal agencies and organizations were all involved, all of which themselves had already been debriefed in some capacity through the National Security Council committees, as well as in other documents I've mentioned where Bush was briefed on some of this. Reagan, while Bush was his vice president, was briefed on these things during Star Wars, Iran-Contra. I mean, literally bringing these papers to the vice president of the United States, showing them the effectiveness of these programs. And then some years later, all of a sudden, and remember, we know where Bush came from as a vice president and where he got his training and how he sort of made his way. This is Bush Sr., how he made his way into the vice presidency and then to become a president later. There's clear that there was already an infiltration mechanism, as some larger conspiracy researchers have already expounded upon. I don't need to go into it, but you know, the 100-year war, the 200-year war that's been going on covertly with either the intelligence apparatus as the tool or the infiltration of the intelligence apparatus to become the tool. This entire program and the programs like it, 200 years ago, people would have been tortured for witchcraft. They would have been burned and killed. Their countries would have been invaded and decimated, and an entire religion would have been introduced to overwrite this knowledge, thereby making it impossible to use it, and that you could only use it if you followed our books. Maybe then we would let you use it. I mean, people have to think about that. Like, this isn't, while these documents and these types of conversations and these books and these movies are very much perceived to be fringe knowledge or fringe interests from the consumer standpoint or from the mass public standpoint, it's actually almost the foundation for some of our largest wars. I mean, aside from what we're often told is just independence and liberty and sovereignty, which in itself is probably a cover for being able to live one's life as they see fit or as they are naturally able to do so. You know, we have to think about that stuff for a little. I think that's the few people that do follow these videos and are watching this channel. The religious wars are not just about land grabs and real estate and money. We're talking about removing people's independence and installing a codependence on a metaphysical system that has largely been a reinterpretation and an editing and a redactism of knowledge and abilities that we all have to begin with, right? So it becomes an artificial dependence, like a gateway. You know, you can only achieve these things if you do X, Y, Z, where that's not actually true at all. And these groups have to know that. I mean, the people that come into these organizations and you know, some people you're going to say, well, they just want to enforce the law and keep the law as it is, and that's sort of a double entendre in that the law or the rule of law is not just about constitutional law, but it's also about humanity. So the Constitution itself, if we're going to go down that route, doesn't say anything about not allowing people to naturally develop their own psychic abilities or giving anyone else the right to burn people at the stake for using these abilities. That is purely coming from one specific set of doctrines. That entire narrative is coming from one specific set of doctrines. So, expected results versus actual results. During the Iran hostage crisis, one of the more interesting characteristics of remote viewing emerged and evolves expected results, as compared to actual results that are sometimes achieved with this unique process. For example, it was imperative that the U.S. military determine suitable infiltration and exfiltration routes for conducting a hostage rescue operation. Consequently, a requisite tasking to identify such routes was given to the Girl Flame members. One of the resulting remote viewing products involved diagonal-like gridwork with blue and orange diagonal squares, which covered an oval-shaped object. Upon initial analysis, this Girl Flame product might have appeared to be a miss on the part of the remote viewer and dismissed as inaccurate. Fortunately, someone followed up on what initially appeared to be a nonsensical result with no apparent connection to the remote viewing tasking. Located about a half-mile from the U.S. Embassy compound in Tehran, a market area covered by a canopy with blue and orange oblique squares concealed an oblong-shaped object that proved to be a manhole cover. U.S. personnel discovered that only Iran has these types of manhole covers. Most countries use round ones to prevent people or objects from falling through. The manhole led to underground phone lines that, disappointingly, led perpendicular to the embassy. Archived area maps, however, reveals that a long-forgotten sewer system dating back to pre-Persian or pre-Roman times and unknown even to the Iranians was physically located beneath the phone line system. The sewer system ran under the embassy compound, exiting into one of its garages, thereby providing the information requested for a potential rescue attempt. This phenomena, which seemingly unrelated remote viewing products actually have a direct connection with the original remote viewing tasking, may account for some of the heretofore determined misses or inaccuracies of past efforts. Moreover, it is reminiscent of the previously mentioned Pat Price episode in which he described 2 water towers that were missing at the time of his actual remote viewing, but had existed many years prior. Understanding these remote viewing peculiarities presented a challenge for both the viewers and tasking agencies involved. As the program evolved and corporate knowledge increased, these idiosyncrasies became better understood and utilized. So that's a pretty interesting story, right? I mean, you could do a movie, an accurate movie on that, and probably should have done an accurate movie on that, but the movies that do exist on that tell us that satellites did all the work and computer hackers did all the work and just really smart people punching keys at a terminal, and then really talented warriors sort of covertly infiltrating specific aspects of society or towns and doing recon on physical locations. Why we would not mention this or give these people credit where credit is due, I mean, doesn't really make sense. I think a couple of these guys have been awarded some specific medals. I actually don't know offhand what they've been given, and I know that there's some pretty high and prestigious medals given within the military ranks for many, many different things, and oftentimes you might get a medal that no one's ever going to hear about because the reason you got it is a top secret mission or function in itself. But it's a real disservice to just say, well, we'll make a movie on this or we'll write a book on it and omit all of this out of there. In fact, it's such a disservice that it later on comes out to undermine any actual positive results of these programs and initiatives. And it removes everybody from the possibility of, I mean, it actually detrimentally affects potential recruitment later on, potential educational aspects later on. It undermines the future by misrepresenting the past, whether intentional or not. Program evolution. After the CIA had ended its official support for the program in 1975, but before INSCOM took over program management responsibilities, the United States Air Force served as program sponsor and worked with SRI in that capacity from 1976 until 1979. The DIA had become interested in the program in 1973 and was more deeply involved by 1976. As previously noted, INSCOM had its own program going by 1978, so parallel, independent efforts were being pursued by various agencies. In 1979, the Air Force disengaged from the program. DIA and INSCOM continued their respective programs until 1986, when INSCOM's program was absorbed by DIA. By 1988, SAIC had taken over SRI's functions, and in 1995, DIA was directed to turn the program back over to the CIA, which then terminated the program that year. A general expansion of the remote viewing knowledge base procedures and applications resulted as these numerous agencies pursued independent and concurrent efforts. This diffusion of effort, however, was accompanied by serious drawbacks regarding program management. While SRI remained focused on refining and developing scientific protocols of remote viewing, INSCOM focused almost exclusively on real-world operational performance and results. This division of responsibilities between SRI and INSCOM would have been more effective had a common monitor or program supervisor administered both programs. As it was, no one officially served in this capacity. Consequently, a gulf developed between the two agencies regarding scientific development and operational performance. For example, SRI would forward its updated research results to INSCOM, which would routinely ignore the information and fail to pass it along to its remote viewers. Consequently, INSCOM had no systematic or programmatic feedback mechanism that enabled its remote viewers to discover whether they were successful or not for particular targets. INSCOM's remote viewers were consequently kept in the dark regarding protocol and methodology improvements developed by SRI, as well as their respective performances. Further, and as Kress notes, military and intelligence organizations assumed results-oriented perspectives that focused on near-term operational results at the expense of exploring and discovering the underlying dynamics of how remote viewing worked. So I think part of that gulf or that gap that the commander references is actually a result of the NSA in some capacity, where I mentioned they were earlier involved in their own programs by the 50s and 60s. And they were tasked with countermeasures. So I suspect that there were many groups or compartments or teams that were trying to figure out how to keep it from happening, how to neutralize this gift or this ability in people, this naturally inborn, God-given gift. And with that, the NSA had developed some protocols where they sort of put themselves into place to decide who gets to use it and who doesn't get to use it as well. And I'm not just harping on the NSA, but whomever was running these organizations. I'm sure that there were other, as we can read by these last two paragraphs here, that other organizations were sharing information between each other. So let's just think about, I'm not going to go into it too deeply now, but let's just consider what those countermeasures might be. Now that some of you have heard this, maybe read this on your own, maybe listened to some of the other videos on here, or went and researched your own documents. And I would advise staying away from the pop culture aspects until you are able to absorb enough from the actual scientific researchers, because too much of that is just, I mean, it's pop culture. And it's too much sci-fi and too much Hollywood in place of actual verifiable, relatable experiences which are presented and demonstrated in the research itself. But after you've absorbed enough of this, what do you think the Army, the military, the NSA, FBI, DIA, CIA, police departments, what do you think, or forget that even, religious fanatics, the people who are most terrified of recognizing these gifts across their entire belief system, what do you think they would do or invent or create as a countermeasure to keep you or your family, your children, what do you think they would do to keep you from demonstrating these abilities? Or if you did demonstrate them, how would they be monitoring that? How would they know how to find you? Because this isn't about paranoia. This is being rational, reasonable, and logical. In other documents, we've seen and read that the entire population experiences this in some fashion or another. Up to today, in today's 2020, 2020, the year 2020, up to potentially 10 million people are actively using it. Up to 5% of that, 1 to 5% of that, are very talented with it. What would that group, having read this, having known that it's out there, this research, what would they do to protect themselves from countermeasures? Because that's how all intelligence works, right, guys? I mean, it's always if then this, if then this, then that, then this. So it's not about paranoia. It's about taking the thought as far as you possibly can and working your way back through a bunch of if-then statements. If they were doing this, then this is possible. If they were doing this, then this may have been possible. If this is out now, what is also out now? And I think that's a fair way to approach this, again, without conspiracy phrases and trying to disenfranchise people or make people seem, or alienate people from very well thought out, very well researched, very well documented books, papers, experiments that have basically spanned the past 300 years of modern documentation and record keeping. All right, I'm going to end this here, and we will pick up on tactical, operational, and strategic implications. Hope you're having a good day or morning. And